They thought you'd never leave, that you'd always be the one to send the message first, to apologize first, to fight for something they never fully showed up for. But when you didn't chase them this time, something shifted. At first, they told themselves you were just being distant. Then they waited for you to snap back into your old self, the one who forgave too quickly. But silence? It's louder than any argument, and now they're replaying every moment in their mind. Every time they pulled away. Every time you needed reassurance and they called you too much. Now you're gone. And they're finally feeling the loss. Because anxious avoidants never miss you when you're there. They miss you when you're done. And the moment they realize they can't reach you anymore, it's not just heartbreak, it's a wake-up call. They don't notice when you're slipping away until it's too late. That's the truth. No one tells you about people with an anxious-avoidant attachment style. They're not absent because they don't care. They're distant because they're conflicted, torn between craving closeness and fearing it. One moment, they pull you in. The next, they push you away. And in that exhausting cycle, you find yourself constantly trying to read between the lines, trying to figure out if they want you, need you, or want to be left alone. You spend so much of the relationship trying to anticipate their next move that you forget how much of yourself you've been losing in the process. In the beginning, they seemed interested, maybe even intense. They asked questions, initiated conversations, made plans. It felt like they were invested. And then slowly, the shift began. Subtle at first, fewer texts, less vulnerability, more surface-level answers to deeper questions. You started to feel the emotional temperature drop, but you kept going, hoping it was just a phase, hoping they'd come back to the version of themselves they were at the start. You gave them grace. You gave them time. You gave them space. And most importantly, you gave them your effort, more than you were receiving in return. But the anxious avoidant doesn't recognize this shift as a problem right away. To them, pulling back feels safe. It feels like protection from vulnerability. When they see you still showing up, still trying, still giving, it reassures them that they can keep their distance without consequences, that you'll always be there no matter how inconsistent they are. They don't consciously register your growing detachment because emotionally they're tuned into self-preservation, not connection. They're focused on what they need to feel in control, not what you need to feel secure. You begin to adjust your behavior. You stop bringing up what bothers you because you're afraid it'll push them further away. You stop asking for reassurance because you don't want to seem needy. You start walking on eggshells, shrinking your needs to fit the space they allow. And still, they don't see it. They don't notice the way your voice sounds different. They don't notice the way you stop reaching out first. They don't notice the way you pause before saying, "I love you," unsure if you still mean it or if you're just saying it out of habit. And even if they do notice it, they convince themselves it's temporary, that you're just having a moment, that you'll bounce back because you always do. They get comfortable with the idea that you'll tolerate the emotional inconsistency. They interpret your loyalty as permanence, so they keep pushing boundaries, testing limits, thinking that if you haven't left yet, you never will. They mistake your silence for patience, your sadness for moodiness, your pullback for a bad day, and all the while, you're slowly letting go, not in a dramatic, storming out the door kind of way, but in small, silent acts of self-preservation. You stop telling them about your day. You stop making the extra effort. You stop dreaming about a future with them because you've finally started to accept the present for what it is. And the irony is, that's the moment it begins to fall apart for them. But they don't know it yet. Because when you start slipping away emotionally, it's not loud. It's not angry. It's not obvious. It's quiet. It's calm. It's subtle. You're still physically there, but your energy is different. You're more reserved, less reactive, less invested. You're conserving your emotional resources because you've finally realized you can't keep pouring into someone who only notices the cup when it's empty. The silence they once craved becomes unbearable. Anxious avoidants are often drawn to the illusion of independence. They romanticize solitude, equate emotional distance with strength, and believe that needing someone is a weakness. So, when the relationship begins, they crave connection just like anyone else. but only on their terms. They want to feel close, but not too close. They want to know you're there, but not always in their space. They want your love, but not your emotional expectations. And when the pressure builds, when things start to feel too intense or vulnerable, their instinct is to pull away, to retreat, to protect themselves from the overwhelming fear of being truly seen, or worse, truly dependent. So they create silence, not always deliberately. Sometimes it's in the form of unanswered texts. Sometimes it's a few days without calling. Sometimes it's being physically present but emotionally checked out. They convince themselves that the distance is healthy, that they're resetting, that it gives them clarity. They tell themselves that if you really love them, you'll understand their need for space. And because they've done it before, retreated and returned without consequences, they think they can do it again. At first, the silence feels like a relief to them, like a break from the emotional pressure cooker of the relationship. They feel in control again. They don't have to deal with your feelings, your needs, your desire for closeness. For a moment, it soothes their anxiety. They're no longer overstimulated by intimacy. They don't have to confront the discomfort that comes with letting someone in too far. And in that initial stillness, they feel powerful, unbothered, free. But silence has a way of turning on them. It starts with noticing the absence of your voice, not just in conversation, but in their routine. They wake up and there's no good morning message. They come home and there's no call from you asking how their day went. They scroll through their phone and realize there's nothing from you waiting to be opened. The quiet that once felt like peace now feels hollow. The silence they initiated now echoes back at them, louder than they expected. They begin to wonder why you haven't reached out. Maybe they expected you to check in, even if they didn't respond. Maybe they thought you'd miss them so much you couldn't help but try again. But instead, there's nothing. No questions, no guilt trips, no attempts to reconnect. And that's when discomfort starts to settle in. The silence, once comforting, now feels unfamiliar. It feels like distance they didn't mean to create. It feels like a wall they built and forgot how to climb back over. Their mind becomes restless. They replay past conversations, looking for clues about where things shifted. They scroll through old photos, rereading comments and captions you once wrote. They look for signs that maybe you're just waiting for the right moment to reach out again. But when they find none, the silence grows heavier. It's no longer a pause, it's a void. And voids are unsettling, especially for someone who once found safety in emotional detachment. They may start to convince themselves you're punishing them, that your silence is strategic, that you're trying to manipulate them into reacting. But deep down, there's a creeping realization that maybe, just maybe, you're not playing a game. Maybe you're just done. And that's when the silence becomes unbearable. Not because it's loud, but because it's unfamiliar, because they no longer control it, because they're no longer choosing it. You are. And for someone who's always needed to feel in control of the emotional dynamic, that loss of power is quietly terrifying. Their control no longer works, and it scares them. One of the defining traits of someone with an anxious-avoidant attachment style is their need to manage emotional closeness on their own terms. They don't just fear being vulnerable, they fear losing control. In relationships, they often rely on subtle strategies to keep the upper hand emotionally, not because they want to hurt you, but because it's how they survive emotionally. It's how they avoid the discomfort of fully investing in someone else. So they keep you at arm's length. They give just enough to keep you close, but not enough to make you feel secure. They know when to show up and when to disappear, and it creates a rhythm where you're always the one adjusting, always the one trying to find stable ground. In this dynamic, control becomes their comfort. If they feel you getting too close, they back off. If you seem distant, they reel you in. They test your boundaries, your tolerance, your patience. They don't always do it consciously, but the pattern is unmistakable. They've learned to read your reactions and use them to regulate their own anxiety. If you respond with panic when they go quiet, it reassures them. If you chase them after a conflict, it makes them feel wanted without having to be vulnerable. If you apologize for needing too much, it confirms their belief that closeness is dangerous and must be moderated. For a long time, these strategies work. You bend, you chase, You try to prove that you're safe, that you're worth opening up to. But eventually, something shifts. You stop playing the role they've come to depend on. You stop reacting the way you used to. You no longer rush to close the gap when they pull away. You no longer beg for reassurance, over-explain your feelings, or try to decode their moods. You grow tired of being the emotional caretaker in a relationship that drains you. And slowly, you begin reclaiming your own control. Not through revenge or manipulation, but through detachment. You start protecting your peace instead of preserving the connection. And that's when their tactics stop working. Suddenly, they can't get a rise out of you. The emotional distance they used to create doesn't bother you anymore. In fact, it feels like relief. When they go silent, you don't fill the space with desperate texts or calls. When they withdraw, you don't chase. You just carry on. And that shift is disorienting for them. What used to trigger you now meets calm. What used to hurt you now meets indifference. And because they rely on your emotional reaction to feel secure in the power dynamic, your lack of response feels like losing control. It confuses them. It disrupts their rhythm. They try to re-engage in small ways, liking an old photo, sending a vague message, casually reaching out without addressing the real issue. It's not vulnerability. It's a test. They want to see if they still have influence over your emotions, if they still have the ability to pull you back in when they want. But when you don't bite, when you don't respond with the familiar eagerness, they start to feel something they rarely let themselves feel: panic. Panic that they waited too long. Panic that the distance they created is now permanent. Panic that the control they thought they had was never real, just borrowed from your willingness to care more, try harder, and hold the relationship together. Now that you've stepped back, the entire structure collapses. They realize that the emotional balance of the relationship was never about mutual closeness. It was about your effort keeping things alive. And without that, they're left with the very thing they were trying to avoid all along. Power without connection, distance without safety, independence without love. Memories hit differently when you're no longer around. At first, they might try to pretend they're fine. They distract themselves. They keep busy. They rationalize your absence. They tell themselves it's probably temporary, that you'll eventually reach out, that this is just another cooling off period like the ones before. But this time it's different, and somewhere deep inside, they know it. You're not just pulling away, you're not just giving them space. You've disconnected in a way that doesn't look like a pause. It looks like you've moved on. And suddenly, the silence that once served as their shield starts to expose everything they never paid attention to. That's when the memories begin to resurface. Not just flashes of the relationship, but the small, seemingly insignificant moments they once overlooked. The way you used to smile at them when they walked into a room. The way you instinctively reached for their hand without thinking. The way you laughed at their jokes, even when they weren't that funny. Those are the moments that begin to haunt them, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were real, consistent, and comforting. They start to remember the emotional security you provided, even while they resisted it. They begin to feel the absence of your presence in the most mundane routines. Waking up alone, going to bed without a message from you, reaching for their phone and realizing you're no longer on the other end of the conversation. What's so unsettling for them is that the very things they once took for granted become the things they can't stop thinking about. At the time, they didn't appreciate how much energy you poured into making the relationship feel alive. They didn't realize how many emotional details you handled behind the scenes, checking in, making plans, giving reassurance, being thoughtful without needing to be asked. You were the emotional anchor in a dynamic they assumed they were controlling. And now that you're gone, that weightlessness no longer feels like freedom. It feels like being untethered. They might not admit it right away, not even to themselves. They might scroll through your old messages, rereading them like a script they wish they'd performed better in. They might find themselves revisiting songs you shared, places you went together, even items they once dismissed as unimportant, a note, a photo, something you left behind. And in those moments, the emotional denial starts to crack. The impact of your absence becomes harder to ignore. It creeps in during the quietest parts of their day, in between meetings, in the car, when their guard is down and their mind has space to wander. It's not just about missing you. It's about realizing they never really showed up for you. They start replaying arguments they brushed off, moments they made you feel invisible, conversations they cut short because they didn't want to go deeper. They remember the times you opened up emotionally and they responded with silence or sarcasm or detachment. And now those memories sting, not because they're just sad, but because they carry regret. The regret of knowing they had someone who genuinely tried to love them and they didn't know how to receive it. The irony is that these memories don't come flooding back in the heat of the breakup. They come later, when everything is still, when no one's around to distract them from the truth. That's when their brain starts to connect the dots. That the version of you they remember is not someone they can just replace. That what they had wasn't casual, even if they treated it that way. And the more time passes, the more those memories become sharp reminders, not of what went wrong, but of what they didn't value when they had the chance. Their ego fights with their regret. When someone with an anxious-avoidant attachment style starts to feel the consequences of losing you, there's a storm brewing beneath the surface. Not just sorrow or longing, but a tug-of-war between two powerful forces inside them. On one side, there's their ego, defensive, proud, determined to believe that they made the right decisions, that they were justified in their distance, that they didn't need anyone. On the other side, there's their regret, quiet at first, but growing stronger as the reality of your absence sets in. And the deeper they fall into the silence you've left behind, the louder that internal conflict becomes. The ego doesn't go down without a fight. It reminds them of all the narratives they've built to protect themselves, that relationships are complicated, that you were probably too emotional, too intense, too demanding, that it wasn't the right time, that they were just doing what they needed to do for their mental health, their independence, their peace. Their ego clings to these explanations like armor, because to strip it away would be to confront something far more painful, that they let go of someone who showed up with a full heart. Someone who didn't walk away after the first conflict, someone who gave them more grace than they deserved, and someone who only asked for honesty, consistency, and emotional presence in return. Regret doesn't show up in a loud, dramatic way. It seeps in slowly, like water under a closed door. At first, it comes in the form of memories they can't stop thinking about, words they wish they could take back, messages they want to send but never do. They catch themselves wondering what would have happened if they had answered differently, if they had stayed a little longer in the conversation you were trying to have, if they had opened up instead of shutting down, if they had chosen vulnerability instead of avoidance, connection instead of protection. Their ego tries to suppress those thoughts. It tells them you'll come back eventually, that you just need time. It convinces them that if they hold their ground, you'll be the one to admit fault, you'll be the one to make the move. But every day that passes without a word from you weakens that illusion. Every day you continue to choose peace over pursuit chips away at the narrative their ego built. And that's when regret gets louder, not just as a whisper of loss, but as a scream of self-awareness they can no longer ignore. They might begin to act out in small ways, trying to soothe the ego without addressing the regrets. Watching your stories, sending vague messages, trying to provoke a response just to see if they still matter. But none of it satisfies what they're truly feeling, because what they're missing isn't attention, it's your presence. What they're aching for isn't power, it's the connection they sabotaged. And as much as their ego wants to hold on to pride, it's regret that tells the truth, that you were someone they never really figured out how to love properly, that they chose fear over growth, that they mistook your consistency for permanence and your grace for weakness. The ego keeps trying to rewrite the story, to find a way to come out on top without admitting fault. But regret doesn't care about winning. Regret only wants to make things right. And in that internal battle, they find themselves stuck, longing for you, but unable to reach for you honestly, needing to feel something again, but afraid of confronting the pain they caused. Their mind spins with what they should do next, whether to reach out or wait longer, whether to risk rejection or stay hidden behind pride. But the longer they hesitate, the more the weight of that regret settles in, reminding them that the hardest part of losing someone isn't just the loss itself. It's knowing you were the reason they're gone. They finally see your worth, but you're no longer waiting. When they first pulled back, They didn't think they were risking anything. They assumed you'd always be there, that no matter how inconsistent they were, how emotionally unavailable they became, or how many times they went silent, you'd still be holding space for them. They thought your love was endless, that your patience had no expiration date, that even if you got frustrated, you'd come back, just like you always did. But now that you're gone, really gone, not just physically, but emotionally, they start seeing you through a lens they never used before. Not from the viewpoint of someone who is taken for granted, but from the perspective of someone who's been lost. Suddenly, the things you did so effortlessly begin to look like rare acts of love. The way you tried to understand their moods, the way you gave them space without resentment, the way you tried to make communication easier, more open, even when they shut you down. They start remembering how you forgave them more times than you should have, how you stayed soft even when they went cold, how you tried to hold the relationship together during moments when they were busy trying to escape it. And it hits differently now, because with distance comes clarity. And now that they're standing on the outside looking in, they begin to realize that not everyone would have done what you did for them. They think about the way you showed up for them, how you remembered the small things, how you made them feel seen, how you tried to bring lightness into the heaviness they carried but never wanted to talk about. You weren't just loving them, you were learning them. You were trying to navigate the walls they built, not because you had to, but because you cared. And now they're looking back, realizing that the way you loved wasn't ordinary. It wasn't replaceable. It wasn't something they could just find again in someone new. But the part that hits the hardest is knowing that they never gave you what you gave them. That while you were pouring energy into building a bridge between your world and theirs, they were busy protecting their own space. That while you were trying to be emotionally available, they were trying to stay emotionally safe. And now that you're no longer investing in them, they start to see what that investment really meant. It wasn't just effort, it was love, commitment, presence, and intention. All things they never fully appreciated until they weren't receiving them anymore. And when they do start to feel the loss, their instinct might be to reach out, to try to reconnect, to test the waters and see if the door is still open. But this time, your silence doesn't come from a place of hurt. It comes from clarity. You're not waiting by the phone. You're not rereading old messages. You're not wondering if they'll finally show up the way you hoped they would. You've stepped into a different version of yourself, one that no longer tolerates emotional ambiguity, one that's finally choosing to give the same energy you once gave to them, but now to yourself. And that shift is something they can feel, not because you told them, not because you made some dramatic declaration, but because the energy is different. There's no more pulling, no more chasing, no more trying to decode their distance. You're not angry, you're not bitter, you're just unavailable. And it unsettles them because they always thought they'd have the chance to fix it when they were ready. But now, for the first time, they're seeing that while they were busy protecting their heart, you were growing out of the version of yourself that begged for love. They see your worth now. They see it fully. They see it clearly.